By April 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, brutal stage. Japan was no longer fighting for victory, it was fighting for survival. Its navy, once the pride of the empire, had been shattered by years of relentless American carrier strikes, submarine warfare, and industrial attrition. Fuel was scarce. Experienced pilots were gone. Shipyards lay in ruins under constant bombing. What remained was resolve and desperation. At the center of this collapsing world stood the super-battleship Yamato. Commissioned in 1941, Yamato was the largest battleship ever built, a floating symbol of Japanese naval doctrine and national pride. Armed with 9 massive 18.1-inch guns, she was designed to dominate any surface engagement. In another era, she might have decided the fate of fleets. But by 1945, the world that justified her existence no longer existed. American naval strategy had evolved beyond battleships. Aircraft carriers now ruled the sea, projecting power hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood this reality, but could not escape it. Its carrier force had been annihilated. Its remaining capital ships were immobilized by fuel shortages and Allied air supremacy. Meanwhile, the United States prepared for the invasion of Okinawa, the final stepping stone toward the Japanese home islands. Hundreds of Allied ships gathered offshore, protected by overwhelming air and naval power. For Japan, Okinawa represented the last defensive barrier. If it fell, the homeland itself would be exposed. Faced with this reality, Japanese leadership turned to a plan born not of strategy, but of necessity, Operation Tengo. The concept was stark in its simplicity. Yamato, accompanied by a small escort force, would sail south toward Okinawa on a one-way mission. There was not enough fuel for a return. Upon reaching the island, Yamato would beach herself and fight as a stationary artillery fortress, using her massive guns against American landing forces until destroyed. Her crew would then join the ground battle. It was, in effect, a suicide mission. This plan reflected the profound shift in Japanese war thinking by 1945. With conventional options exhausted, sacrifice became doctrine. Just as kamikaze pilots were sent against Allied ships, the greatest battleship ever constructed was now to be expended in a final act of defiance. Yamato was no longer a weapon of victory, it was a symbol meant to die with honor. American intelligence was already watching closely. Code breakers intercepted Japanese communications, tracking fleet movements and intentions. The United States Navy, with its vast carrier forces positioned around Okinawa, was prepared to respond instantly. What Japan saw as a final stand, the Americans saw as an opportunity to eliminate the last remnant of Japanese surface power. Operation Tengo was not a battle that could change the war's outcome. That was already decided. But it would become something else entirely, a tragic collision between old doctrine and new reality, between steel and air power, between honor and inevitability. As Yamato prepared to sail, the world's largest battleship carried with her not just guns and armor, but the final hopes of an empire that had run out of time. The battleship Yamato was never intended to fight a desperate last stand. She was conceived as the ultimate expression of Japanese naval power, a vessel so heavily armed and armored that no enemy could challenge her in a traditional surface engagement. In the years before the war, Yamato embodied a single, powerful belief that decisive naval battles would still be won by battleships, not aircraft. Laid down in secrecy in 1937 and commissioned in December 1941, Yamato was built around overwhelming force. Her main battery, 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship, could hurl armor-piercing shells weighing over 3,000 pounds across more than 20 miles. To protect these guns, Yamato carried armor of unprecedented thickness, designed to withstand direct hits from any existing naval artillery. Everything about Yamato was designed to dominate a single, decisive clash. Speed, protection, firepower, and endurance were balanced for one purpose: destroy the enemy's battleships in a final fleet engagement, fulfilling the long-held Japanese doctrine of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle that would determine the war at sea in one climactic moment. Yamato's very existence was a state secret. Her construction was hidden beneath massive sheds. Her true specifications were known only to a small circle of naval officers and engineers. To the Japanese public, she represented technological mastery and national pride. To the Navy, she was the ultimate answer to American industrial superiority, a single ship meant to outweigh many. But the world changed faster than Yamato could. Even as she was completed, naval warfare was undergoing a revolution. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse, and later the battles of Coral Sea and Midway all demonstrated a brutal truth. Aircraft carriers had replaced battleships as the dominant weapon at sea. Engagements were now decided beyond visual range, long before big guns could be brought to bear. Yamato, despite her power, spent much of the war inactive. Fuel shortages, fear of air attack, and the loss of Japanese carriers forced the Navy to preserve her as a fleet in being rather than risk her destruction. She participated in limited operations, including the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where she survived intense air attacks but accomplished little strategically. By 1945, Yamato had become a paradox. She was still the most powerful battleship afloat, yet she was strategically obsolete. Her guns could not reach enemy carriers. Her armor could not stop aerial torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs delivered in mass. Her fate was no longer in her own hands, but in the skies above. And yet, Yamato retained immense symbolic value. She was more than steel and armament, she was the embodiment of imperial ambition and martial tradition. To abandon her without a final fight was unthinkable to many within the Japanese command. If Yamato could no longer win the war, then she would be used to die in service of it. Operation Tengo transformed Yamato from a weapon of supremacy into a vessel of sacrifice. The battleship that had been designed to rule the seas would now sail directly into a domain she could not control. The myth of battleship supremacy had already been shattered. Yamato's final mission would make that truth undeniable. On April 6, 1945, the battleship Yamato slipped her moorings and began her final voyage. There were no illusions among her commanders about what lay ahead. Operation Tengo was planned as a mission without return. The fuel allocated to the task force was barely sufficient to reach Okinawa, there was none reserved for the journey back. Every officer aboard understood the implication. This was not an operation meant to succeed, but one meant to be endured. The force that accompanied Yamato was modest and symbolic rather than practical. Alongside her sailed the light cruiser Yahaji and 8 destroyers. This was all that remained of Japan's once mighty surface fleet that could be spared. There was no air cover. Japan's carrier aviation no longer existed in any meaningful form, and land-based aircraft were already committed to kamikaze attacks against the American invasion fleet. From the moment the task force left port, it was being watched. American submarines detected the Japanese ships almost immediately. Contact reports were sent, tracked, and relayed through the vast Allied intelligence network supporting the Okinawa invasion. For the U.S. Navy, Yamato's sortie was not a surprise, it was confirmation. The last capital ship of the Imperial Japanese Navy was on the move, and it was moving south. As Yamato steamed through the East China Sea, the atmosphere aboard grew heavy and restrained. Crews carried out their duties with discipline, but without optimism. Personal belongings were sorted. Letters were written. Some sailors performed quiet rituals, others simply stood at their stations, listening to the steady vibration of the engines. There would be no dramatic speeches, no promises of victory, only silence and acceptance. The Japanese command hoped for one narrow possibility: that Yamato might reach Okinawa under cover of weather or timing, close to gun range, and unleash her massive artillery against the Allied fleet before being destroyed. Even limited damage, they believed, might delay the invasion or raise the cost of American victory. But this hope ignored a fundamental reality. The seas around Okinawa were dominated by American aircraft carriers operating in lead formations. Hundreds of aircraft patrolled the skies continuously. Radar coverage extended far beyond visual range. Any large surface force entering this zone was exposed from the moment it appeared. By the morning of April 7th, American carrier groups had completed their preparations. Aircraft were armed and fueled. Strike leaders were briefed. The hunt was about to begin. Yamato and her escorts continued south, their course unwavering. There would be no retreat, no diversion, no second plan. Ahead lay Okinawa. Above lay the enemy's skies. Operation Tengo had crossed the point of no return. On the morning of April 7, 1945, the fate of the battleship Yamato was sealed not by naval gunfire, but by aircraft launched from beyond the horizon. Long before she could approach Okinawa, American carrier task forces detected the Japanese ships and began assembling one of the largest single anti-ship airstrikes of the war. Wave after wave of U.S. Navy aircraft lifted off from multiple carriers, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, coordinated with precision. This was the full expression of modern naval warfare: massed air power, guided by radar and intelligence, converging on a single, exposed target. At approximately 12:30 p.m., the first American aircraft appeared over Yamato's task force. Japanese lookouts sounded the alarm as the sky filled with attacking planes. Anti-aircraft guns erupted along Yamato's massive hull, sending thousands of shells into the air. The battleship's firepower was immense, but it was designed to repel surface threats, not to withstand repeated, coordinated aerial attack. American pilots quickly exploited Yamato's vulnerabilities. Torpedo bombers focused on her port side, aiming to induce a fatal list. Dive bombers attacked from altitude, releasing armor-piercing bombs onto her deck, superstructure, and gun turrets. Explosions ripped through the ship as fires spread uncontrollably. Yamato's escorts were overwhelmed almost immediately. The cruiser Yahaji was crippled by torpedoes and bombs, losing power before finally capsizing and sinking. Destroyers were sunk or forced to withdraw, leaving Yamato increasingly isolated under the onslaught. Despite her immense size and armor, Yamato could not escape physics. Multiple torpedo hits flooded her engineering spaces. Her speed dropped. The list to port grew more severe with each strike. Damage control teams fought desperately below decks, but the flooding was too extensive and the fires too widespread. By early afternoon, Yamato was barely maneuverable. Her guns, once intended to dominate fleets, were useless against the enemy attacking from above. Smoke and flame enveloped her superstructure. Survivors later recalled the deck tilting beneath their feet as the ship struggled to remain upright. At approximately 2:20 p.m., the inevitable occurred. With her internal compartments compromised and stability lost, Yamato rolled sharply to port. Moments later, a massive internal explosion, likely from her forward magazines, tore the battleship apart. The blast was so powerful it was visible from miles away, sending a towering column of smoke and debris into the sky. When the smoke cleared, the largest battleship ever built was gone. Of the more than 3,000 men aboard Yamato, only a few hundred survived. The rest went down with the ship, trapped below decks or thrown into oil-covered waters. Operation Tengo had ended in complete destruction. The battle had lasted only hours. Yamato never fired her main guns in anger. She never reached Okinawa. She never engaged the enemy she was built to fight. The sky had decided her fate. The sinking of Yamato on April 7, 1945, was more than the destruction of a single warship. It marked the symbolic and practical end of the battleship era, closing a chapter in naval history that had defined power at sea for nearly half a century. In purely military terms, Yamato's loss changed little on the tactical level. Japan no longer possessed the capacity to challenge Allied naval dominance. The invasion of Okinawa continued uninterrupted. American fleets remained intact, their carrier aircraft operating with near-total freedom. Operation Tengo had failed in every measurable objective. But strategically and psychologically, the impact was profound. Yamato had been the embodiment of Japan's pre-war naval doctrine, the belief that superior firepower and armor could decide the fate of nations. Her destruction by aircraft underscored a reality that could no longer be ignored. Surface ships, no matter how powerful, were helpless without air superiority. Battleships had become secondary weapons, vulnerable and exposed in a sky-dominated battle space. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, Yamato's loss was a final confirmation of defeat at sea. The navy that had once shocked the world at Pearl Harbor was now reduced to symbolic gestures and sacrificial missions. There were no reserves left. No strategic reversals possible. What remained was endurance, not victory. The sinking also resonated deeply within Japan itself. News of Yamato's fate was tightly controlled, but within military circles, the meaning was unmistakable. The Empire had lost not just a ship, but the illusion of technological salvation, the belief that one perfect weapon could overcome industrial and numerical inferiority. For the United States Navy, the battle reinforced lessons already learned. Carrier aviation had proven itself beyond dispute as the dominant force at sea. Radar, coordination, and massed air strikes had replaced armor and artillery as the decisive elements of naval combat. Yamato's destruction was not a triumph of brute force, but of systemic superiority. In hindsight, Operation Tengo appears almost ceremonial, a final, tragic gesture rather than a coherent military operation. Yamato was sent to die not because she could change the war, but because her survival no longer had meaning within Japan's collapsing strategic framework. Her loss foreshadowed what was to come. Within months, Japan would face strategic bombing, atomic devastation, and eventual surrender. The age of battleships, like the empire that built Yamato, had reached its irreversible end. The seas would never again be ruled by guns alone. In the years after the war, the battleship Yamato did not fade quietly into history. Instead, she grew into a mythic symbol, carrying meanings far beyond her brief and tragic final mission. More than any other warship, Yamato came to represent the rise, ambition, and ultimate collapse of Imperial Japan. For many in Japan, Yamato embodied sacrifice and duty. Her final voyage was remembered not as a strategic failure, but as an act of resolve in the face of inevitable defeat. Popular narratives focused on the courage of her crew, the discipline maintained until the end, and the willingness to face death without retreat. In this telling, Yamato became less a weapon of war and more a vessel of collective memory. This transformation was reinforced by post-war culture. Books, films, television dramas, and anime portrayed Yamato as a tragic hero, powerful, dignified, and doomed by forces beyond her control. These portrayals often emphasized emotion over analysis, turning the ship into a symbol of national suffering rather than a case study in strategic miscalculation. Over time, Yamato drifted from history into legend. Outside Japan, Yamato occupies a different place in memory. For naval historians, she stands as the ultimate example of doctrinal failure. Built at enormous cost, she rarely influenced the course of the war and was destroyed without ever engaging in the decisive surface battle she was designed for. Her story is often used to illustrate how quickly technology and strategy can render even the most advanced weapons obsolete. Modern scholarship has sought to bridge these perspectives. Yamato is now understood both as a human tragedy and as a lesson in military evolution. The courage of her crew is acknowledged, while the strategic futility of Operation Tengo is examined without sentimentality. In this balance, Yamato's true legacy emerges, not as a flawless symbol, but as a warning written in steel. The wreck of Yamato lies deep in the East China Sea, discovered decades after the war. It rests broken but recognizable, a silent witness to its own history. Like the wrecks of Truk Lagoon or the remains of sunken carriers, it reminds us that naval warfare is not defined by intention, but by outcome. Yamato's story endures because it speaks to universal themes: pride, adaptation, and the cost of refusing to change. She was the greatest battleship ever built, and proof that greatness alone cannot stop history. In remembering Yamato, we are not just recalling a ship. We are confronting the moment when an old world finally gave way to a new one. Operation Tengo was conceived as a final act of resistance, but history judges it differently. When examined without myth or sentiment, it stands as a stark example of a battle that was never meant to succeed, only to be endured. By April 1945, the outcome of the Pacific War was no longer in doubt. What remained was the question of how that end would be faced. From a strategic perspective, Tengo was futile from the moment it was approved. Japan lacked air cover, fuel, and operational flexibility. The American invasion fleet at Okinawa was protected by overwhelming carrier air power, radar networks, and lead defenses. Even if Yamato had reached the island, her guns could have fired only briefly before being destroyed. The operation offered no realistic path to altering the campaign's outcome. Yet Tengo reveals something essential about Japan's wartime leadership in its final months. Decision-making had shifted from calculation to symbolism. Military actions were judged not by probability of success, but by perceived honor and moral value. Sacrifice became strategy, and survival lost its place as a goal. In this environment, Yamato's destruction was not a failure, it was an expected conclusion. For the United States, the battle reinforced an already settled truth. No surface fleet, however powerful, could operate without control of the air. The rapid destruction of Yamato validated the carrier-centric doctrine that would define naval warfare for decades. It also confirmed that the war was entering its final phase, one in which Japan could no longer meaningfully contest Allied operations at sea. Why, then, does Operation Tengo continue to matter? It matters because it marks the true end of the battleship age, not in theory but in practice. Yamato was not defeated by another capital ship. She was erased by aircraft before she could engage. The weapons, tactics, and assumptions that had shaped naval power since the First World War were rendered obsolete in a single afternoon. Tengo also forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths. Courage alone does not compensate for strategic failure. Technology without adaptation becomes a liability. And honor, when divorced from reality, can lead to unnecessary destruction. Operation Tengo was not the last battle of the Pacific War, but it was the last battle of a worldview. After Yamato sank, there could be no lingering belief that tradition or willpower could reverse Japan's fate at sea. The war would continue for months. More lives would be lost. But with Yamato's final plunge, one truth became undeniable. The era of the super-battleship was over. Operation Tengo endures not because of what it achieved, but because of what it reveals. It stands as one of the clearest case studies in military history of how power collapses when doctrine, technology, and reality drift too far apart. The battleship Yamato was not defeated by a superior ship. She was defeated by a superior system. By 1945, the United States Navy had perfected a form of warfare built on information, coordination, and reach. Radar detected targets beyond the horizon. Carrier aircraft struck hundreds of kilometers from their decks. Command structures allowed rapid adaptation in real time. Yamato, for all her armor and firepower, belonged to an older logic, one that assumed decisive battles would still be fought gun to gun, ship against ship. Operation Tengo exposed the fatal cost of clinging to that logic. Japan's leadership understood, on some level, that Yamato would not return. Yet they proceeded anyway, driven by institutional inertia, cultural expectation, and the inability to accept irreversible change. What might once have been considered courage became resignation. What was framed as honor became inevitability. This is why Tengo matters far beyond naval history. It illustrates how great powers fall, not suddenly, but incrementally, when adaptation is delayed and symbolism replaces strategy. Yamato was the most powerful battleship ever constructed, yet she was rendered irrelevant before she could fulfill her purpose. Her destruction was not a surprise attack, but a predictable outcome of a war that had already moved on. For modern audiences, Yamato's final mission serves as a warning written in steel and fire. Superiority today does not guarantee relevance tomorrow. Weapons, doctrines, and institutions that fail to evolve eventually become monuments to past thinking. Operation Tengo was Japan's last naval operation of consequence. It was also the final confirmation that the Pacific War would end not with decisive surface battles, but with air power, industrial dominance, and total strategic control. Yamato sailed to die in silence, not to change history, but to mark the moment when history had already changed without her. And that is why Operation Tengo is not just a tragic footnote, but a defining lesson of 20th century warfare.